As I said, it's amazing to be a part of a global community. We've had a handful of members of the Nashville church who have been visiting other places in the world. And so if that describes you, we'd love to have next Sunday some people share. We've had some people in Colombia, in Ecuador, in France. It'd be great to be able to hear about what they've experienced. I think we might have some folks from North River as well. Is that right? Okay. So welcome, again, global community all the way in Atlanta, which depending on traffic can actually be, really, really far. A few things real quick. It was mentioned, I want to say Katie, but I guess it's Hope. In the foyer, you can sign up for helping with, different Hope projects. You can also sign up for the blood drive if you want to help with that. Parker has helped organize this blood drive over the past handful of years, and he was telling us it's been one of the biggest blood drives in the area. So that's why we kind of feature this one. But if you want to give, you can sign up. The other thing you can sign up for in the foyer is our youth luau. So basically this Saturday evening, I think we might have a slide we can show. That's going to be here at the building, and it's kind of for anybody mid-20s and under, just kind of for everybody to get together and have some fun. So if that describes you, come. But if you could sign up so people know how much food to get and all that kind of stuff. But if you're not 25 and under, or if you're married, we're going to have a party coming back from the conference on August 13th. So Debbie's excited about that. I heard somebody else screaming back there. The old people, that are married, we like to have fun too. And so more info to come. But then also, just real quick, there's going to be a baby shower on Saturday, July 31st. At 1 here for Kenny and Lily. And so they'll have that in the newsletter next week as well. But they just wanted to let everybody know if anybody wants to come and encourage Kenny and Lily with a baby on the way. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to continue our series on Ezra and Nehemiah. And we've been kind of, as has been mentioned, right? I really appreciated what Edric and Priscilla shared and just their vulnerability. And man, wasn't it awesome just for them to share just about kind of their very real life walk, right? And what they're going through. And they talked about how we're talking about rebuilding. And that's what last Sunday was about, was just rebuilding. And this Sunday, we're going to talk about legacy. And again, what we're doing is just looking at some topics through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so legacy. Why would we want to talk about legacy when it comes to Ezra and Nehemiah? Well, first, what does that mean? What is legacy? So definitions: a gift by will, especially of money or other personal property, a bequest. That's not what we're talking about here. When we're talking about legacy, we're not talking about your inheritance necessarily financially. But then the second definition: something transmitted by or received from an ancestor or predecessor or from the past. So this is what we're going to talk about here. The idea of legacy within Ezra and Nehemiah. So just to kind of give context, we've talked a lot about context as we've talked about Ezra and Nehemiah. We've shown this slide a couple of times, this next slide, with these three different sequences, right? It's Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. The rebuilding was done in kind of these three different phases as we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah. Incidentally, if we haven't mentioned this, or if you're kind of just jumping on this today, Ezra and Nehemiah originally were just one book. So we kind of in our Bibles have it as two books, but it's one book. And that's kind of historically how it's been. And it has these three different phases that go on over the course of something like 75 years. So we read it and we think, oh, it all happened really fast. No, it didn't. It took a long time. And so we've been kind of looking at some of the different things that went on and some of the patterns that we see throughout these three different phases. And so basically, though, as we think about the exile, Ezra and Nehemiah is about Jews who are coming out of exile, and they're coming back to Jerusalem from Babylon to rebuild their city. And the exile created a crisis of faith and a crisis of identity. What do I mean by that? The Jews believed we are God's chosen people, and one of the reasons we know that is because he's given us this land. And we have this very specific way that we worship God, this very unique relationship with God, and that's tied to the land and to the temple. And so what happened over time is they thought, well, that's just who we are, that's our identity, and because we are God's chosen people, nobody can mess with us. We're kind of unconquerable, unbeatable, and they kind of got lax when it came to worshiping God and really focusing on pleasing God in the context of a relationship with Him. So then, over time, the nation of Israel became two separate groups, the south and Judah and the north and Israel. So over time, in 722 BC, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians and they were all deported. So imagine a people who say, we're God's chosen people so nobody can mess with us. And then they're conquered. And so the people in the southern part, in Judah, they thought, well, you guys messed up and you guys weren't faithful to God, but we're God's chosen people. You guys went and started worshiping other gods and worshiping in different ways and worshiping in different places, but we're where Jerusalem is and we have the temple. So we're different. We have this identity in Jerusalem, in the temple, in who we are as God's people. And so nobody can take us, right? We are truly the ones who cannot be conquered. And that worked for about 130 years. And in 586 BC, the Babylonians came in and conquered and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And then many of them were grabbed and they're deported to Babylon. And so the reason all that's important is because these people thought my identity is in being God's chosen people and having Jerusalem and the temple. That's who I am. That's who we are as a people. And now that's gone. And so as they come back to Jerusalem from Babylon, there's this real crisis of faith and crisis of identity in terms of what does all this mean? Who are we? In a sense, what is our legacy? And that's why we want to talk about legacy. And so what we find in Ezra and Nehemiah is we find some potential answers. As we look at these books closely, we can find some potential answers to how were they seeking to answer this question of who are we now that Jerusalem has been destroyed and the temple has been destroyed. Who are we supposed to be? What does this relationship with God mean? We thought we had it figured out, and clearly we missed something, and so we come back and we rebuild them. And what is it we're trying to attach our identity to? And so as we look through Ezra and Nehemiah, there's some patterns we see. There's some things that are consistent. And one of those things that can be, if you've read Ezra and Nehemiah, these are just the chapters you skip. What do I mean? Well, if we can look at this slide. You can't even read that, right? That's by design. Up at the top, these are the people of the province who are going up from the captives of the exile with King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had forced into exile in Babylon. These are the people that are coming back. And then it's just all these names. And I didn't even, intend for you to read it. Because when you're reading Ezra and Nehemiah, you don't read it either. You just kind of, okay, there's a list, there's a bunch of people, let me just skip down to where, the list ends. But one thing you see is just descendants, right? There's all these descendants, the descendants of this person, descendants of that person. It's just these lists of all these descendants. And so ask yourself, why? Why would this be included in the Bible? Why did the guy who put together Ezra and Nehemiah decide we need to include all these names and all these lists and all these descendants and all these genealogies? If you look so this was Ezra chapter 2. If you look in Nehemiah chapter 7, you see, you can't really tell, right? But these are the people of the province who returned from the captivity of the exiles, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had forced into exile. It's like almost word for word, the exact same list. So an author sat down and said, I'm going to have this book, and in chapter 2, I'm going to include this list. And then in chapter 7 of the next book, where it's, over here later at the end of Nehemiah, I'm going to include the exact same list with the exact same people. Instead of just saying, hey, look back at chapter 2. But it's the same thing. Like if we go through just Nehemiah 7, it's the same list and the same people. If you look in Ezra chapter 8, you have, again, very similarly, another list. If we can find Ezra 8. There you go. And one of the common words is just descendants. Like all these descendants of all these different people I can't remember if there's another slide with Ezra 8, but the other ones are Nehemiah 11. There's another list, long list of people. Again, these are the provincial leaders who settled in Jerusalem. Why is it so important for these things to be recorded in the Bible? All these names and all these people. And then Nehemiah Chapter 12, same deal. You kind of get the idea, right? So why? Why this focus on names and genealogies? It's because what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, God chose us as his people, and then we were conquered and exiled, and as we come back, we want to establish we're the same people. We want to make sure that we understand, because we're searching for identity, we want to make sure that we understand who we've come from and who we're connected to, and that by blood, we are connected to the same people that God chose many, many, many years ago. And so the idea here is it's legacy. They're trying to establish a connection with the past. That's why we have all these lists. Now, we see this further in Ezra Chapter 2, at the end of that list. In verse 59, it says, "These are the ones that came up from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Kerub, Adon, and Emer, although they were unable to certify their family connection or their ancestry as to whether they really were from Israel. The descendants of Deliah, the descendants of Tobiah, and the descendants of Nekoda, and from among the priests, the descendants of Hobiah, the descendants of Hakkoz, the descendants of Barzillai, who had taken a wife from the daughters of Barzillai the Gileadite, who was called by that name. They searched for their records in the genealogical materials, but did not find them. They were excluded from the priesthood." Why is this included? Because there were people who could say, I can trace my ancestry back to kind of the original God's people. And then there were people who were like, hey, we're really one of you. We're really one of the Jews. We just can't prove it. And they said, that's nice, but you can't serve. And what that shows us is there's this intensity with trying to figure out who are we. And for them, it was very important. We've got to show that we are tied back to the people who were here before. And that's, again, why we see these lists. The other thing is there's an intentionality in terms of connecting what they're going to do to the religious practices from the past, the worship from the past. In Ezra 1, when Cyrus first sends the people back, it says, he brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his God. Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought to Mithridath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And then you see the inventory, right? 30 gold basins, 1,000 silver basins. Like, again, I know you just gloss over this. I know you're not trying to memorize, okay, exactly how many silver basins did they have? It's really important for me to know that. But it's included. Why is it included? In all, there are 5,400 articles. They bring them back, and again, it's all about worship. It's all about, we're trying to legitimize that we're doing things right. We're doing things in a way that honors God. We're trying to connect again to the past. In Ezra Chapter 3, it says, when the 7th month came, and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. Then Joshua, son of Jozadak, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of God, of Israel, to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred festivals of the Lord, as well as those brought as freewill offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. So, again, it's just a bunch of religious observation, right? But it's, if you go back and you read in Leviticus 23, and the way that in Leviticus God says, here's how I want you to worship, you see that the author here is trying to say, we're trying to do it the way we see in Leviticus. Like, there's a very clear connection, even the idea of the 7th month. Why? If you read through Ezra and Nehemiah, the 7th month keeps coming up. Why? Well, it was a very important month for the Jews, according to Leviticus 23. The first day of the month is a Sabbath rest. Regardless of whether it is actually a Saturday or not, The first day of the month was supposed to be a Sabbath rest. The 10th day of the month was the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. The 15th day of the month is when the 7-day festival of Tabernacles started. So like the whole month, and on that, you're supposed to go live in booths or tabernacles that you build, and it's like the whole week of worship, and then at the end of it, there's another Sabbath day. So it's like, man, this is like a fourth of no, maybe not even like a third, or almost half of the month is just these times to worship God. And so what, again, we see here is Ezra and Nehemiah are saying, we are trying to do things, we're trying to connect back to what we saw in the Old Testament, and we're trying to connect back all the way back to Leviticus, and all the way back to the beginning when God was first showing people, we're going to try to be kind of the original people of God. Again, this intentionality. And it's not just the narrator that put Ezra and Nehemiah together making this point. In Ezra Chapter 5, they had started to rebuild the temple. And Haggai and Zechariah, we talked about last week, it inspired them to do so, and opposition started, and the opposition comes and says, why are you building? And this is the answer they gave in chapter 5, verse 11. It says, we are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, one that a great king of Israel built and finished, not because our ancestors angered the God of heaven. He gave them into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar the Chaldean, king of Babylon, who destroyed this temple and deported the people to Babylon. So again, you see that even as they describe their own history, there's hey, who are we? We're connected back to these people. The reason we're doing what we're doing now is because of this connection that we have back to the past. In Ezra Chapter 7, it says, after these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, son of Sariah, and then you see, again, all the names, right? I'm not going to read all the names, but you see who he was, and then verse 6, this Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a teacher well-versed in what? The law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. In verse 10, for Ezra had devoted himself to study and observance of the law and teaching its decrees and laws in Israel. What most people think is when you talk about the law of Moses, you're talking about the first 5 books of the Bible. The Torah or Pentateuch, the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So even though this is kind of the end of the Old Testament period, they're trying to identify all the way back to that first time, that time when God's people are being created, put together. God is calling them. He's creating this covenant with them. And so you see this theme of legacy, of who are we? Where did we come from? We want to go back and we want to make sure as we rebuild, that we rebuild with this emphasis on connecting to what God did through Moses. You see the same kind of thing in Nehemiah. In Nehemiah, he hears that the walls have been broken down, and he's heartbroken. And so he prays to God, and he says, Lord, in Nehemiah Chapter 1, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive, your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. So again, as Nehemiah prays, hey, we blew it. And notice he says we. He doesn't just say they messed up. We as a people messed up. But God, you made this promise that if we repent, you're going to call us back together. And so he's trying to claim that promise as he's trying to figure out what he needs to do moving forward. In the next chapter, it says he was cupbearer to the king. So as he's with the king notices something's wrong with you. And Nehemiah explains, well, yeah. And so in Nehemiah chapter 2, in the end of verse 2, he says, I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins? Again, notice he's connecting back to his ancestors. Its gates have been destroyed by fire. The king said to me, what is it you want? I prayed to the God of heaven. I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so I can rebuild it. Again, we just see this. Okay, he wants to rebuild, but he's connecting back to ancestors. He's connecting back to the past. In Nehemiah Chapter 8, again, when the 7th month came, remember the 7th month, and the Israelites had settled in their towns, all the people came together as one in the square before the water gate. They told Ezra, the teacher of the law, to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. So on the first day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, which was made up of men and women and all who were able to understand. He read it aloud from daybreak till noon as he faced the square before the water gate in the presence of the men, women, and others who could understand, and all the people listened attentively to the book of the law. You might say, hey, Matt, you're reading a lot of the Bible. Okay, granted. But they did from daybreak until noon. And you guys didn't get here at daybreak. And we'll see if we get done before noon. We're going to get done before noon. I'm just kidding. But, if we're going to be a Christian church and we really want to be people who are putting the Bible into practice, we need to study the Bible. But this is what they did. And so Ezra gets up there and he's reading from Scripture and saying, okay, this is who we want to be as a community that goes back to, again, the community that God created with and through Moses. So they see as Ezra's reading, oh man, there's some things that we haven't really been putting into practice that we need to put into practice. And one of those was the festival of booths or shelters. So in verse 17, it says, the whole company that returned from exile built temporary shelters and lived in them. From the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day, the Israelites had not celebrated like this, and their joy was very great. Now, notice, who were they connecting back to? They could have said from the days of Hezekiah or from the days of Josiah, which were kings much later, but they're not trying to connect back to that. They're saying from the days of Joshua, which is when Israel first came into the promised land. So again, you have to see that Ezra and Nehemiah are being connected back to Leviticus, back to Moses, back to Joshua. They're skipping most of Jewish history and going all the way back to the beginning because that's what they wanted their legacy to be. That's what they were trying to connect back to. Verse 18, day after day, from the first day to the last, Ezra read from the book of the law of God. They celebrated the festival for 7 days, and on the 8th day, in accordance with the regulation, there was an assembly. So they're looking back, and this is how they're trying to define themselves moving forward. Legacy. That they believed that they had been given this legacy that many of their forefathers had failed to really live up to, but they're trying to grab hold, right, of this legacy. And so we're connected to our past. We're shaped by our past. But we still have to decide, okay, who do we want to be moving forward? And so that's what they were doing, but that's what you and I are doing. That's what we need to do. We need to say, okay, who am I and what has shaped me and what has made me? And that you might say, oh, well, that's really bad and I have to overcome a lot of that. That's fine. Or you could say, I've been so blessed and I've got this amazing legacy, and that's fine too. Either way, it's realizing, okay, my legacy, my past, it's a part of who made me who I am today, but I still have to decide who I want to be. And I think about my legacy. I think I have a picture here. I think Priscilla mentioned my parents. So my parents are actually in Knoxville today. But this is my parents and me when they first went to Argentina as missionaries. This is in the airport when they're first getting to Argentina in 1980. And I'm, not even, I think, a year old at this point. And so this is a part of my legacy, is parents who said, you know what, we want to go serve God in another country, and they got a group of their college friends together, and nobody told them to, and nobody organized it. They put it together, they raised the funds, and then they decided, where do we want to go? They landed on Argentina, and they went, and they did the best they could to try to preach Jesus. That's a part of my legacy. And I'm super grateful for that. But even if I take it kind of a step further back, next slide. This is my mom's parents, Bruce and Lydia Jackson. And they, when my grandfather came back from World War II, he went to Bible college and decided he wanted to be a preacher. And so they were, preacher and preacher's wife, and they traveled Alabama, Virginia, Kentucky, and he just preached his whole life. And he shared the Bible with people and taught people, and I think he was a big part of inspiring my mom and just the environment she grew up in. And they were trying to live their life based on Scripture and based on what they saw in the Bible. And so that's a part of my legacy, is not just my parents, but my grandparents who passed this down, right? And they were married for over 50 years before they passed away. And again, even just that legacy, right, of what it means to have a great, stable marriage, and that's possible. Then my dad's parents, Herbert and Dot Brown, he was an elder in the church that they grew up going to. Well, actually where my grandmother grew up going, and then he ended up converting to be a part of the Church of Christ, where she had grown up going her whole life in Atlanta. But they were just always servants, always serving in the church. They're both sets of grandparents were the kinds of people where if the church was having something, they were there. And so that's how my parents grew up. It was just very simply, we're going to try to put Scripture into practice. And again, that's a part of my legacy, which I'm so grateful for. I'm so humbled by. And then my grandmother Dot, her mom Jeanette, and this is my great-grandmother. So this is when Adriana and I got engaged, and we're sitting down with her, and this is at Christmas, and she was 99 at the time. And, we just sat down, and we're sharing our story, and she's sharing her story. She got married when she was 16. She was born in 1901, and this was in 2000. So she had seen the whole century, right? When she was a teenager, her parents moved into a community in East Point, Atlanta, and they lost one of her siblings, died. And they had built kind of friendships with the neighbors, and the neighbors, who were members of the local East Point Church of Christ, just started bringing over meals and just started loving up on the family and invited the family. If we can show the next picture, this is actually the East Point Church back, around that time, early 20th century. And so the family came out and became Christians. And my grandmother was baptized as a teenager in the East Point Church of Christ, and I don't remember exactly, something like 1915 or something like that. And again, that's a part of my legacy, because then that's the church. This is the church as they remodeled and all that kind of stuff, but this is the church she grew up in, and then my grandmother grew up in, and then my dad grew up in. And so that's a part of my legacy, which I'm so grateful for. But here's the thing. I still have to decide, what do I believe? Who do I want to be? I can't just ride the coattails of what's gone before me. I've got to make my decisions about who I want to be. And you might say, Matt, that's cool, but my story is totally different. I don't have all that. I got, dysfunction all over my family, and it's a lot harder for me. Okay, granted. I'm not going to argue with that. I feel like I'm very lucky and blessed to have, these stories to tell. But we're still in the same place. We're still here today, and we still have to decide, okay, what kind of life do I want to build? What kind of faith do I want to build? What does this look like for me? This is the idea of legacy. And so then it becomes, okay, I've been given this great legacy. What am I going to pass on? Right? We all want to pass something on. We all want to have a legacy to pass on. What if, over 100 years ago, my great-grandparents, I guess great-grandparents, as they moved to East Point, what if they didn't have a church? that reached out to them, and this teenage girl didn't become a Christian, then my legacy is totally different. I think sometimes we can not realize the impact of opening our mouths, of loving the people around us, of, hey, some teenage girl becoming a Christian could begin a legacy that goes on for generations. And that's the God that we serve. But it's our choice. We have to make choices about what we want our legacy to be. And that's what we see here in Ezra and Nehemiah. They're trying to connect back to that. And we feel like in the church here, we're at a crossroads. We're at a time where, okay, who have we been? And who do we want to be? And we feel like it's a really exciting time. We're excited about the plans that we have, but we do feel like it's also time to evaluate. Who have we been? What is the legacy that's been passed down to us? And who do we want to be? What do we want to do? What do we believe God is calling each of us to do? Zerubbabel believed God was calling him to go and rebuild. Ezra believed God was calling him to go and rebuild. Nehemiah believed God was calling him to go and rebuild. We have to figure out, okay, what is God calling me to do? What is my part in all this? And first of all, they were very focused on just worshiping God, right? It was about God. It was about being, hey, we want to be God's people. We want to live a life of worship. And for them, it meant picking up and moving across the world. You might look at a map and think it's not that far. No, for them, it was across the world. It took Ezra 5 months to get from Babylon to Jerusalem. They wanted to make it a priority to build God's house. And so I want to kind of, wrap up here, close, looking at, okay, there's a couple situations. How did they do this? What did that look like? And in Ezra Chapter 9, the people come up to Ezra and say, hey, there's some problems. There are people who are worshiping foreign gods, and they've married foreigners who have caused them to participate in these abominations and worshiping these foreign gods. And so Ezra, what does he do? In Ezra chapter 9, verse 5, it says, then at the evening sacrifice, I rose from my self-abasement with my tunic and cloak torn, and fell on my knees with my hands spread out to the Lord my God, and prayed, I am too ashamed and disgraced, my God, to lift up my face to you, because our sins are higher than our heads, and our guilt has reached the heavens. From the days of our ancestors until now, our guilt has been great. Because of our sins, we and our kings and our priests have been subjected to the sword and to captivity, to pillage and humiliation at the hand of foreign kings, as it is today. But now, for a brief moment, the Lord our God has been gracious in leaving us a remnant and giving us a firm place in his sanctuary. And so our God gives light to our eyes and a little relief in our bondage. Though we are slaves, our God has not forsaken us in our bondage. He has shown us kindness in the sight of the kings of Persia. He has granted us new life to rebuild the house of our God and repair its ruins, and he has given us a wall of protection in Judah and Jerusalem. So Ezra is faced with a crossroads moment in his community, and he immediately goes to God, and he's again connecting back to the past and to sin from the past and to the consequences they've seen. And he's saying, we want to learn from our mistakes. And we want to begin to restore this community. But they did need to address the idolatry. We're going to talk more about kind of some of the specifics of that next week, which is another theme that runs throughout these books. But again, what they're trying to do is root their identity in what they saw before them, what their legacy was, and what they needed to learn from that. And so in Ezra chapter 10, once Ezra's ready to kind of do something here, in verse 5 it says, so Ezra rose up and put the leading priests and Levites and all Israel under oath to do what had been suggested. They took the oath, and Ezra withdrew from before the house of God and went to the room of Jehohanan, son of Eliashib. While he was there, he ate no food, drank no water, because he continued to mourn over the unfaithfulness of the exiles. A proclamation was then issued throughout Judah and Jerusalem for all the exiles to assemble in Jerusalem. Anyone who failed to appear within 3 days would forfeit all his property in accordance with the decision of the officials and elders, and would himself be expelled from the assembly of the exiles. Within 3 days, all the men of Judah and Benjamin had gathered in Jerusalem, and on the 20th day of the 9th month, all the people were sitting in the square before the house of God, greatly distressed by the occasion and because of the rain. Now, I think this is a great example of, okay, the community is facing a crisis. They're in a crossroads moment, and they have to figure out, who do we want to be moving forward? And we want to work together, and we want to be a unified community. And so they say, hey, everybody who wants to be a part of this community, you need to show up. And if you don't show up, then you're not going to be a part of the assembly. The Greek word ekklesia, which is the word we get church from, just means assembly. So you're going to be kicked out of the church. You don't get to be a part of the community if you don't want to be unified with what we want to do going forward. That's how they approached this and how they handled it. And again, we'll talk next week about maybe did they go overboard with some of these things. But we can see the heart that says, let's do this together. Let's figure out together who we want to be, because then we can help each other and encourage each other. So then the other example here is during Nehemiah's time, there was a similar crossroads moment. It wasn't necessarily connected to, again, the same kind of idolatry or crisis. It was more just they were reading the Bible, they were reading the law, and they're like, man, we really need to recommit ourselves to really taking seriously what we're learning about what the Bible teaches. And so in Nehemiah Chapter 9, we see they kind of just go through this history. In verse 7, it says, "You are the Lord our God who chose Abraham and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and named him Abraham." Now, as we read this, just think about the idea of legacy, right? I mean, I'm hoping that as we read these things, you see these themes that we're looking at. Verse 8, "You found his heart, Abraham's heart, faithful to you, and you made a covenant with him to give to his descendants the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Jebusites, and Girgashites. You have kept your promise because you're righteous. You saw the suffering of our ancestors in Egypt. You heard their cry at the Red Sea. You sent signs and wonders against Pharaoh, against all his officials, and all the people of his land, for you knew how arrogantly the Egyptians treated them. You made a name for yourself, which remains to this day." Down in verse 13, he goes on, they go on. This is actually like a community prayer is the way that this is presented. And in verse 13, "You came down on Mount Sinai. You spoke to them from heaven. You gave them regulations and laws that are just and right, and decrees and commands that are good. You made known to them your holy Sabbath and gave them commands, decrees, and laws through your servant Moses." Down in verse 16, "But they, our ancestors, became arrogant and stiff-necked, and they did not obey your commands." Verse 19, "Because of your great compassion, you did not abandon them in the wilderness." Verse 22, "You gave them kingdoms and nations, allotting to them even the remotest frontiers." Verse 28, "But as soon as they were at rest, they again did what was evil in your sight. Then you abandoned them to the hand of their enemies, so that they ruled over them. And then when they cried out to you again, you heard from heaven, and in your compassion you delivered them time after time. Now therefore, our God, the great God, mighty and awesome, who keeps his covenant of love, do not let all this hardship seem trifling in your eyes. The hardship that has come on us, on our kings and leaders, on our priests and prophets, on our ancestors and all your people, from the days of the kings of Assyria until today. In all that has happened to us, you have remained righteous. You have acted faithfully while we acted wickedly. Our kings, our leaders, our priests, our ancestors did not follow your law. They did not pay attention to your commands or the statutes you warned them to keep. Even while they were in their kingdom, enjoying your great goodness to them in the spacious and fertile land you gave them, they did not serve you or turn away from their evil ways. But see, we are slaves today. Slaves in the land you gave our ancestors so they could eat its fruit and other good things it produces. Because of our sins, its abundant harvest goes to the kings you have placed over us. They rule over our bodies and our cattle as they please. We are in great distress. In view of all this, we are making a binding agreement, putting it in writing, and our leaders, our Levites, and our priests are affixing their seals to it." And then we have, after this, a list of all the people who signed this and said, we are going to make a covenant that we're going to change, we're going to repent, we're going to commit ourselves to wholeheartedly worshiping God And there's all these details about what that means and what that looks like, obeying the Sabbath and the sacrifices and the festivals and getting rid of the idolatry in the community. But then wrapping up in Nehemiah chapter 10 and verse 37, as they finish up this covenant that they're creating and making with God, they say, moreover, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of our God, to the priest, the first of our ground meal, of our grain offerings, of the fruit of all our trees, and our new wine and olive oil, and we'll bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all the towns where we work. A priest descended from Aaron is to accompany the Levites when they receive the tithes, and the Levites are to bring a tenth of the tithes up to the house of our God, to the storerooms of the treasury. The people of Israel, including the Levites, are to bring their contributions of grain, new wine, olive oil to the storerooms where articles for the sanctuary and ministering priests, the gatekeepers and musicians are also kept. And then this is kind of how they finish. We will not neglect the house of our God. So there's all the details, right? But at the end of the day, their heart is, we want to honor God. We will not neglect the house of our God. And again, I think our community is a lot like these communities, in the sense that we have been enslaved, right? We've all experienced, challenges in one sense or another, and we've come out of a tough time as a community of faith, even before COVID. The Nashville church, the church that just went through some tough times and some tough chapters, an exile, if you will. But then you have a pandemic, which, enslaved us in kind of a different way. And it's just kind of gotten us to this crossroad point where, okay, who have we been? But now who do we want to be? And it can be a time, it's been a hard time, but it can be a time where God works in our hearts and where we can recommit. Where we can say, okay, who do we want to be? Let's make a commitment as a community about who we want to be as God's people. And that's, at the end of the day, that's what we, like I said, we feel like we're at a crossroads, and that's what we're asking of you, the church, is that this time, as we come out of exile, as we talk about rebuilding, that we reset, that we recommit ourselves. Not like in Ezra where there's because of a crisis. There's not necessarily a crisis. We're just coming out of a weird time. And we feel like it's the right time to say, hey, let's acknowledge where we're coming from, but who do we want to be moving forward, and what does that look like? And what we are committed to as a community of faith, and what we're asking you to commit to, if you want to be a part of this community, is fairly simple. We've tried to put it in a way that's fairly simple, and we've kind of talked about this through the year, and we've basically talked about 3 concepts based on 3 scriptures. And I think that this is the next slide. And this is the way Jesus did his ministry. The greatest commandment is to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. The new commandment is to love one another as he loved us. And then the Great Commission is, let's go love other people. Let's share the gospel with them. Whether that means spiritually giving to them, physically, monetarily giving to them, but let's go love people. So we just talked about, hey, this is who we want to be as a community. Now, what does that mean? Like if we look at the next 3, the next slide, again, love God. What does it look like to love God? What does it look like to really be in great relationships with one another? What does it look like to love the lost? And so the last slide here is just practically speaking, we're a community that we want to be people who spend time with God, who take it seriously, that on a daily basis, we're going to connect with God. We're going to spend time with God. And that's just not something that we ever want to back off of. We just feel like, no, it makes sense. If we're gonna as a community commit to something, let's commit to, hey, let's spend time with God. And let's encourage each other with that and help each other figure out what that looks like and how to go deeper and how to do so in new and different ways. But we're not going to let God get crowded out of our life. And then what is the one another relationships and loving each other the way Jesus loved us? We believe that being in a small group is essential to that in a larger church. And every member of the church needs to be an active participant in a small group. Not, I'm in a small group in theory, but I'm an active participant in a small group. And that we have one another relationships. What does that mean? A friend? We want you to have friends. Yeah, we're going to insist as a church that Jesus says we're supposed to love each other the way that he's loved us. And so we're going to insist, if you want to be a part of this community, this is what we're trying to do, is we want to have friends where we can help each other grow spiritually, but we believe that takes an intentionality. That doesn't, in our busy lives, that doesn't just happen on accident. And then, the last thing, we're going to share the gospel with people. Again, whether that's serving the poor, whether that's sharing scriptures with people, teaching people about Jesus, but we're going to make time for these things. This isn't complicated, but for all of us to say, okay, am I willing to commit to this? And even as I think about this, I think, you know what? I need to confess. I don't feel like my prayer life is what it needs to be, is what it is. I love to read. My times with God are often lots of reading. And I need, and especially as I look at the last few weeks and last few months, my prayer life needs to grow if I'm going to really make this commitment to this community. Another thing is I think about the one another relationships. I get with people, but I feel like I need to learn to be a better friend. I need to grow in this area of really the friend part. And it's easy just to talk about all the different things going on and be busy, but I need to grow in the friend part of this. But that's the commitment I want to make. I want to be a part of this community. And these are some things I need to work on and I need to change, but I'm committing to be a part of this community. And so this is what we're asking the church to do, is to think about and evaluate. Where are you? Is this something you want to be a part of? But we do want, as we move forward into really exciting times, and after the conference, we're going to have some announcements about some of the practical ways that we're moving forward. And we're excited about moving forward as a church. Basically, we just want to know who's with us, who's on board, who wants to be a part of this, who wants to be a part of building an incredible community of faith that we all love being a part of and where we can make an impact in Middle Tennessee. And so over the next month, we're asking you to pray and think about this. And in a month, when we kind of talk about the details and the specifics of where we're going as church, we also want to put a survey out there to the church. And basically, the point of the survey is, do you want to be a part of this? Do you want to be a part of this community? And maybe you say, yes, absolutely. I'm going to spend time with God. I'm going to be a part of a small group. I'm going to go after one another relationships. I want to get back to sharing the gospel or continue sharing the gospel. I want to commit myself to this community. Or maybe you say, I want that, but that's just not where I'm at right now. That's okay. What we want to know is who wants to be a part of this. If you're like, no, I get it and I want to, I just need some help getting there, or I've got some things I need to work through, I need to talk to some people, I have some questions, I have some concerns, that's fine. We want everybody on board, but we need to be on the same page if we're really going to be a unified community. I've mentioned a few different times that my son Ty runs cross country. And embarrassing here. At the beginning of the summer, they sent a contract. Said, if you want to be on the cross-country team, you have to sign this contract. And it included, lots of different things. Being at the practices and being at the cross-country meets. And, you have fees, to cover all the uniforms and travel. But it's a contract. And if you want to be a part of the team, this is what's expected. Adriana and Ty went to the middle school tryouts, and Adriana said there was a boy who had a really rough day and was just throwing up. And what if he went to the coach and he said, hey, coach, I want to be a part of the team, but this running thing, it doesn't agree with me. So I want to be a part of the team, but I'm not going to come practice. I just kind of want to show up to the game, so to speak, to the meets. That's great. It's great he wants to show up. But if he's not willing to sign the contract, if you will, right, then that's fine. Like, you don't have to run cross country. But there's a commitment that we make, and And it's just kind of the same concept. Is this something we value and something we want to be a part of? And so we're asking everybody to really think about this. And let me say, I said this a few weeks back. We are not saying this is the only church. We don't believe that. We are not saying this is the only way. We don't believe that. We're not saying this has anything to do with salvation. That's not what this is about. We're just saying, hey, this is the plan. Who wants to be a part of it? And maybe your response is, I want to be like that kid, and I don't want to come to the practices, and I'm not going to put in time during the week, but I do want to show up on Sundays and show up to cheer on the team, to observe and be a fan at the game, so to speak. Not that Sunday is the game, but I just want to attend on Sundays. You are more than welcome. We want you to do that. That's awesome. We just need to know who's going to be a part of what we're doing, and who doesn't, and then who needs help getting there. And so, again, like I said, we're going to send this out, and we're asking you between now and, after the conference a month from now to really be praying and thinking about these things. And again, it's because we're excited about where we're going. We're excited about rebuilding. We want this spiritual family to leave a lasting legacy in Middle Tennessee. That's, legacy. Ezra, Nehemiah, what legacy are we going to leave? I want to close with a prayer. I know I've thrown out some pretty serious things, and we've had a pretty serious Bible study today. And as I'm praying, Priestley and Barry are going to come up, and they have a few things, kind of church